Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being, and Henri Bergson, duration. Still, we're talking about duration in this video. In the last video, I basically talked about, I said as much about duration itself as I wanted to in the last video. In this video, there are some other things related to duration I want to focus on. So we'll look at simultaneity, which is kind of the opposite of duration, but it's more like what physics thinks time is. Bergson called it simultaneity. He wrote a book, or there's an essay, I think it's a book, called Duration and Simultaneity. I haven't read that, but that was an attempt to explain how duration was different from relativity in particular. So we'll look at simultaneity, and we'll also talk about duration in relation to motion, which is another important feature for Bergson, and here's some really interesting things to say about this. And then we'll look at the lived present and duration in the natural world. So there are kind of 4 different sections to this video. Let's jump into the first one, simultaneity. So simultaneity, basically this is the time that our clocks measure. And so when we think of time, we tend to think of its passage and the way that we kind of measure that with clocks. I mean, it could be anything, right? A swinging pendulum measures the passage of time. So anything really regular measures the passage of time. So we think we're measuring time itself. But that's not what's happening, Bergson would say. Clocks don't measure duration. Instead, they just count simultaneities. So that is to say, they count events in relation to other events. Events that happen simultaneously with other events, not measuring time itself, not counting time itself. And the reason for that is, remember that duration, time itself, real time, not original, genuine time for Bergson is that succession of elements interpenetrated into each other and apprehended as a whole. So that's what duration is. That's what time is for Bergson here. It's an intensity. It's something which can only be lived. It's qualitative. It can't be counted. It can't be quantified. It's not measurable. So anything that purports to measure time obviously isn't. It's measuring something else. And what it's measuring, Bergson says, is simultaneity. So it's counting simultaneities, events that happen in relation to other events. And one way to think about this is that if we take, Bergson thinks of a pendulum, a swinging pendulum, which I guess is a clock, basically, right? A pendulum counting off the seconds. And outside of me, in space, the hand of the clock, or the pendulum, the swinging of the pendulum, the motion of the pendulum itself is only ever in one place at a time. Right? It's in other words, the past has no meaning here. There's no temporal depth to anything. There's only what's there in front of us in space at any given moment. So there's no duration to anything. There's no past, there's no future, there's only what's happening now, laid out in space. And whatever we use to try and measure time is never going to be more than just a spatial representation at a given moment. And that we can put many of those together. Of course, we can put up different frames, frame by frame, if you like, the swinging of the pendulum at this point, at this point, at this point, and so on. We can stick those up, but we're not seeing the progression of time. We're not We're not counting time itself. What we're doing is, obviously, we're spatializing time. What we end up representing isn't duration. It's not time. It's time which has been spatialized. And so all that the clocks are measuring or clocks are counting are events that take place simultaneously, simultaneities. So I might, what's my example for this? So event A happens when the pendulum is at this point. Event B happens when the pendulum's here. Event C when the pendulum's over here. But there's no flow in that. There's no duration in that when I try and represent it to myself. The only duration, the only time only existed in the passage from A to B to C. Afterwards, after it's completed, then I can represent it. A happened when the pendulum was here, B when the pendulum was here, C when the pendulum was here. But I'm not counting, I'm not measuring time. I'm not getting a picture of time. I guess I am getting a picture of time, but it's a watered down version. It's a time which has been spatialized, which is now complete, which I can revisit in any order I like. I can speed up some parts of the process if I'm not interested in those, and I can slow down at other parts. So there's no actual duration. What we're doing is just counting and measuring what's happening in relation to the pendulum. Event A happens when the pendulum's here, right through to event C happening when the pendulum was here, event C happening when the pendulum was here. But that's what we're counting here. The simultaneities, the relation between the events and the pendulum. And Bergson talks about the way that this gives us the illusion of time as being something quantitative, something we can measure, something we can count. But how does this arise? This arises for us by a double effect. And the first part of this is that we spatialize our conscious states by mapping the progression of our conscious states in duration onto the spatial movements of the pendulum. So that's the first movement. And the second one is we organize the oscillations of the pendulum, which were originally one at a time, into a whole laid out all at once by introducing a fourth dimension of space, which we then call time. So I'll just run through those again. The double effect. The first, we spatialize our conscious states by mapping the progression of our conscious states, which happen in duration, genuine time, onto the spatial movements of the pendulum. So I can note that when the pendulum was here, my conscious state was A. Pendulum was here, my conscious state B. Pendulum here C, so on and so forth. So I get this. I take something which was originally pure intensity, which was originally experienced in duration, and I connect it to something which is happening in space, moving in space, changing in space. And that gives me, and that's what simultaneity is. It's just mapping these simultaneous events. So we spatialize our conscious states first. That's the first step. And then we organize the oscillations of the pendulum, which originally took place one at a time in succession, in duration, for us anyway. We organize those into a whole, which we can stick out in front of us, and introduce a fourth dimension, which they move through, and we call that time. But that fourth dimension obviously is just another spatial dimension. It's a timeline, right? It's literally a dimension in space. It's just there's nothing temporal about it, and that then gives us the impression that time, which is something we feel, duration is something we experience. It's an intensity, has has this property of being countable, measurable, because we map our conscious states onto some regular movement of an object in space, map that out, throw that up against the wall so we can see a progression moving in a spatial dimension. We call that time, and we've got our conscious states laid out on this timeline, which again is a spatial, represented spatially, and we think, okay, good, we're measuring time, we're counting time, and we aren't. We're counting a kind of a facsimile of time. We're counting time which is has been spatialized. So he calls simultaneity the interaction of time and space, because in it, duration becomes space. Duration is spatialized. So that's simultaneity, and it's how it relates to duration, and Bergson spent a lot of time pushing that point, and I think that's one of the reasons why he kind of faded, because Einstein relativity, this became central, this became such a key idea that if anyone was really resisting it, I think it would be difficult to maintain relevance going forward. But his point is not that relativity is wrong. It's not that science is wrong. It's just that it's not treating what it thinks it's treating. It's not dealing with duration. It's dealing with a time that works in our equations. It's a model, right? That's what physics deals with. Models, not reality itself. Representations of reality, and it has to do that. But which is not a criticism of it. But I think particularly now in our scientific age, and back then too, when science was just as important as it is today. I mean, maybe not quite as much, but now it's so mainstream. We just think scientifically. We think that science tells us how the world is, and really, I mean, Bergson's saying it's not. It's missing something pretty fundamental, and it's something which cannot be expressed in equations or models. And when you try and do that, you end up with simultaneity, not duration. Okay, so let's look at the comparison with motion. All right, so motion. So this is kind of an interesting point, and Bergson talks about it a lot. And it parallels what he wants to say with about duration, the way that we spatialize duration. We do the same thing with movement. We take movement, which is fundamentally something that happens in duration, and we think that we can break it down into parts. We can take this thing which is fundamentally a whole and cut it up, analyze it, and when we do that, rather than we think we're describing movement, we think we're talking about movement, but actually we've spatialized movement, and so movement is originally more than a spatial process. I didn't want to use the word process, but it's more than a spatial, it's more than something merely happening in space. It fundamentally requires time. And when we take that out from it, take out that aspect of duration, we're left with something which is no longer movement. And that leads to paradoxes, like Zeno's paradoxes, which we'll come to in a moment. So that's why this section's important. Two aspects of motion: process and positions. Obviously, you've got the different positions that an object moves through, but that's not enough to describe movement. You also have to have the process, the sense of the duration, the becoming. The object has to actually move through those positions, It's not enough to just describe the positions. We have to have time for the object to move through them. So it's fundamentally a process as well as positions. A process can only take place with duration. That's basically what I just said. And treating movement as something only spatial is insufficient, because that juxtaposition in space, putting up the different positions of the object as it moves from A to B, lacks the movement, right? It lacks any sense of actual progression from A to B. If I just stick up where say an arrow, where the arrow was at this time, then at this time, and at the end, I can do that. We can see, yeah, it was in each of these positions, and then it finished up here. But to do that is obviously to miss what is essential in movement, which is the passage from A to B. So when we do it, when we present it like that, when we represent it in this way, we lose the very thing we're trying to measure. In exactly the same way we talked about spatializing duration. So spatializing motion by treating it as a spatializing motion through position solidifies it into an object. So now, instead of having this qualitative process, which we can't really get a grip of, we can't manipulate mathematically or even intellectually, we can't quite grasp it. But when we have the object moving, when we've got it locked into these positions, now we've got something tangible. We've got it moved from here to here, and at each point I can see where it was in its progression. Now there's something. Now there's an object that I can take hold of and treat like an object. I can chop it up, break it up into many different parts if I want, because you can do that with an object. You can't do it with a process. If you break up a process, you lose the sense of progression. You lose the duration that's fundamental to a process. So once we solidify movement into an object, and the object will be the trajectory of the moving thing. So once we treat it as mere trajectory, when we treat movement as just trajectory, then we can divide it up. We can deal with it in any way that we deal with any other spatial object. And this is exactly what we saw, what I talked about just before, when we mapped our psychic states onto events in the world, onto events around us, say a swinging pendulum, or the second hand of a clock. And what we're doing here is mapping movement onto the imaginary line the object traces in space, onto its trajectory. And so, and here's the quote, movement visibly consists in passing from one point to another, and consequently in traversing space. Now the space which is traversed is infinitely divisible, and as the movement is, so to speak, applied to the line along which it passes, it appears to be one with this line, and like it, divisible. Has not the movement itself drawn the line? Has it not traversed in turn the successive and juxtaposed points of that line? Yes, no doubt. But these points have no reality except in a line drawn, that is to say, motionless. And by the very fact that you represent the movement to yourself successively in these different points, you necessarily arrest it in each of them. Your successive positions are, at bottom, only so many imaginary halts. You substitute the path for the journey, and because the journey is subtended by the path, you think that the two coincide. But how should a progress coincide with a thing, a movement with an immobility. Right, so that's a nice long quote, but I think nails it, right? That just exactly is what we're talking about here. A couple of points. He says the movement traverses points in space, obviously. It goes through different positions. But these points have no reality except in a line drawn, that is to say, motionless. So the points are, in a sense, artificially created by us. They're not in the original motion, in the original movement. It moves through the points, but when we take the motion, the progress as completed, and hold up kind of the trajectory, then we just have a line in space, and then we can look at each point on that line and say, yep, it was here, it was then here, and so on. When we break up the movement like that, that is artificial. So those points that we're looking at, they're artificial points. The object didn't stop at each of those points, right? It's not kind of leapfrogging through its movement to each point. But when we break it down as something spatial, as a trajectory, then it can seem like that. It seems like it's just moving through from one position to another position to another position. But no matter how small you go, there's always movement that you're covering over in between the positions. Now you're taking something which was a whole, the progression from A to B, and now when you kind of chop it in down the middle, we've got another progression from here to here, and then you chop it again. There's always still a progress that you're missing, that you're never capturing. No matter how small you go, it's like the progress is always one step ahead of you, so you never quite capture it. And that's because chopping it up like that, trying to find the movement in the line, is to chase the end of the rainbow. You never get there. The movement isn't in the line; it's in the whole thing itself. It's in the journey, not the path. That's a nice analogy. So those points that we analyze when we're trying to understand motion, when we're thinking about the movement of something from A to B, those points are artificially created by us. They're not genuinely there in the motion itself. So when we look at the points, when we look at the moving thing at each of those points, we're not capturing anything to do with motion. Obviously, because at each point the thing is motionless. There is no motion there when we isolate the moving object at a particular moment. There's no motion there. It's how can you find, as Bergson says, how can you find movement by analyzing things that aren't moving? So the second point that I wanted to make here is that he says something interesting. The trajectory is infinitely divisible. So we can think about, if you think about the way something moves from A to B, the movement is it's a continuous progress, right? It's something which is continuous, and it can't be broken up. You can't divide this in any way. The movement it is a whole. If you break their movement in half, you don't have the movement anymore. The movement from A to B is only a movement from A to B if we take it as a whole. If we take the whole kit and caboodle together, then then we have the movement, we have the progress. But what is infinitely divisible, what is divisible, and not just divisible, but infinitely so, is the trajectory, the spatialized line we use to represent the motion, the movement. So now we've got this line, and a line in space. We can chop that up as many ways as we like, right? No problems. You can divide that up as deep as you want to go, as sharp as your scissors are, is how finely you can chop up that line. And that, if you come to that point where you have something which is infinitely divisible, that's a sure sign that you're dealing with an abstraction. Because in truth, all movement, which is a process, which is therefore duration, is absolutely indivisible. You can't divide up something which is time. You can't divide up something which takes place over time, because in order to divide it, you've had to treat it as space. So motion, which is fundamentally a process, is only a whole. It's only one thing, and you can't cut it up into smaller pieces. You can, but that's spatializing it, and it takes out the very thing which is central to it, which is the sense of motion, is the progression, right? So anytime you come across a situation where you're able to divide something up indefinitely, it's a sure sign that you've abstracted out from whatever it is that was genuine, from the duration that you were trying to capture, or from the movement that you were trying to capture in this case. And this brings us to Zeno's paradoxes. We'll have a look at one. I've taken this section from Creative Evolution because I think he explains it quite well in there. He talks about the arrow. So Zeno's paradoxes purport to show that movement or change is an illusion. That's the idea behind them all. And so one of his paradoxes, there were a few, involves an arrow. And he says, if you take an arrow and watch it move from A to D, say, point A to point D, we can see it at different points in that path. So at each point, if we were to stop if we freeze the playback, we can see it. It's at this point, right? Defined by the length of the arrow. It's at this point at this time, and then it's at this point at this time. And at each point that we decide to measure the arrow, any time we look at the arrow during its supposed motion, we see that it's actually stationary. So it's stationary at every point. And no matter how deeply we go, how finely we chop up our points, the arrow is always stationary. And so since the arrow is always stationary at every point, there is no such thing as motion. Motion is an illusion. So what do we think about that? Quite a common way that people think of refuting Zeno's paradoxes these days is through calculus, which is the study of continuous change. And in particular, in this case, lets us supposedly derive an instantaneous speed of an object. And so if you could do that, obviously, if you could show that at a given instant, any given moment in time, that the arrow has a speed, then you've refuted Zeno, because his claim is that at every point it's stationary. But this doesn't work because it's a bit beyond what I want to talk about to go into detail on this. I've written an article about it. If you're interested, it's on my website. But in order to get the instantaneous speed of the arrow, you have to take 2 points and calculate the average. So you calculate the speed at point A and at point C, and then find the average, and you get the speed at point B. And then if you want to go further, you can take A and B, find the average of that, and slot that in the middle, and so on. And you eventually get down to, you approach a limit, is the idea, and that limit is the instantaneous speed. But obviously you're assuming that the arrow's moving. It has a speed already, right? In order to find the average speed, you've got to assume that there's speed. So if you assume that the arrow's moving with a speed at the beginning, of course it's going to, it's no surprise you end up with an instantaneous speed. But you've just assumed the very thing that Zeno denies is true. So that doesn't get us there, I think. But we can see that when we look at it the way that Bergson has explained it, we have motion from point A to point, what did I say? D? Well, I don't know why. Point A to point D. When we break that motion up into individual points, we're counting on the trajectory of the arrow. We're not counting the movement itself. We've missed the movement already. So with that way of thinking about this, essentially Bergson dissolves Zeno's paradoxes. I've got a quote for you here. At bottom, the illusion arises from this, that the movement once effected has laid along its course a motionless trajectory on which we can count as many immobilities as we will. From this we conclude that the movement, whilst being effected, lays at each instant beneath it a position with which it coincides. We do not see that the trajectory is created in one stroke, although a certain time is required for it, and that though we can divide at will the trajectory once created, we cannot divide its creation, which is an act in progress and not a thing. To suppose that the moving body is at a point of its course is to cut the course in two by a snip of the scissors at this point, and to substitute two trajectories for the single trajectory which we were first considering. Done. And then Zeno's paradoxes out the window. But it's and he's just bringing in everything we just talked about before related to motion. Once you spatialize it, you can treat it as a thing. You can chop it up, and importantly, once you spatialize it, there is no movement anymore. Obviously, there's just immobile points on a line. There's just immobilities, a whole sequence of them, which you can obviously then say, there's no motion in, because there isn't any motion in them anymore. You've already abstracted the motion out. You've taken the motion out by conceptualizing it this way in the first place. So, fantastic. There goes Zeno. The one thing I wanted to say here, what was it? So there are a couple of signs here. Right from the beginning, actually, there are a couple of indications that Zeno's talking about an abstraction and not the real world. That he's talking about a spatialized model or representation of movement and not movement itself. The first is we have to suppose the movement completed, like Bergson says. Once the motion has been effected, has been finished, we can count it. But something in progress, we can't count. We have to wait, or we have to imagine it as already being finished. Right? While the arrow is moving from A to D, there's no completed trajectory to cut up. It's in process. But once it's finished, then we can see this. Or once it's finished, then we can demonstrate that there's no motion anymore. But obviously there isn't, because it's finished. The motion is in the in the moment as it's happening. That's where the motion is. Once you wait, or just imagine the completed motion, then you've got the same thing. But the motion itself is in the progress of the arrow. The other thing was, when we isolate the movement at a single point, we create two trajectories. And I liked that, actually. It reminded me of something I thought of a long time ago when I was first thinking about Zeno's paradoxes. There's, what was it in relation to? He argues another paradox is that, I think it's Achilles can't run from one side of the stadium to the other, or something like that. That's the claim. And the reasoning behind it is that in order to get from one side to the other, from A to B, he would first have to run from A to the middle, A to half of B, and then, but in order to get to here, he would have to run to the middle of that. In order to get to that, and he'd have to run to the middle. And you can do that forever. As we said, you can chop that up indefinitely. So Achilles never has time to get to get anywhere. The movement, the motion is again shown to be an illusion. But that's exactly what we were just saying, right? Once you can divide something up indefinitely, you're no longer dealing with genuine motion. You're no longer dealing with genuine duration or time. You're dealing with an abstraction, a conceptualization. Really, really powerful idea, I think, that one. When we isolate the movement at a point, we don't get the trajectory. We don't analyze anything about the we don't analyze anything about the movement. We just break it up. Now we've got two separate movements, which obviously that's not what we're trying to analyze in the first place. All right, let me jump to the next point, which is the lived present. So we tend to think of the present as a mathematical point, or like an infinitely thin line between the past and the future. Something that, we're kind of, it's nothing in and of itself. It's more like the dividing line between the two, past and the future. But this is an ideal present. It's a pure concept. There's something else, another way of thinking about the present, which makes it something real, something concrete, and that is to treat it as duration, to treat it as what he calls a lived present. And so this is obviously very reminiscent of people like Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, and especially the way that Bergson calls this lived present sensory motor, which is, that's exactly how Merleau-Ponty talks about it, right? So that's interesting. What does this mean? That this lived present is sensory motor. Let's break it down. So duration always has one foot in the immediate past, and one in the immediate future, right? So I talked about that. I think I talked. There's duration in the present. We're not kind of locked into this instantaneous moment, an instant that's actually a fiction. Rather, there's temporal width there. The immediate past is part of our present, and so is the immediate future. So the immediate past is sensation, because this is how the succession of elementary vibrations is translated. That's what we talked about with memory. Very briefly, I think I talked about this with memory. You've got succession, or maybe I didn't. It's the article I'm writing, I think. There's a succession of events which memory lets you gather together and apprehend as a whole. And that's what it is to have the succession interpenetrate the different psychic states, or the different events in the succession. They interpenetrate when you bring them together, gather them together, and see them as a whole. So that act takes up, obviously not an instant. It gathers up events from however far back you're going, right? It could be the last 10 seconds, it could be the last 10 years, but it takes that succession of events, gathers them up, so it's incorporating sensation from the past. That's the idea. So that's how this present incorporates the past through previous sensations, which it gathers up and represents to itself in a totality, in a whole. And also, on the other side, the immediate future, this is action or movement, because the future is something we, or all of our actions, all of our any action we take is always directed towards the future. Right? We never act in the moment, in a locked-in present. Our actions always, the way I've described it before, they always lean into the future. So, and that way, that's how the part of the future is incorporated into our present. So we've got these two. We've got the present, where the past is incorporated into it through sensation, which is previous sensations which memory has collated for us, and the future, which is which is incorporated through action, because all of our actions lean into the future. They're all future oriented, directed to a goal. So we have the sensory and the motor, and that's what Bergson means when he talks about the lived present being sensory motor. It's a temporal. It's a temporally thick way of thinking about the present. That's a terrible description. But yeah, you can see what I mean, hopefully. Sensory motor takes up the way that the past and the future are incorporated into the present. And this makes it something real. This makes it something that we live. It's not just an abstract mathematical concept anymore. Now it describes the actual present for us in terms of duration. So that, again, coming back to duration. And since sensation and movement both occur in my body, then my present consists in the consciousness that I have of my body. Great. And now here we have, again, the importance of the body for Bergson, which Merleau-Ponty picks up on later. So, really, we're just connecting threads all the way through here between, really, particularly Merleau-Ponty and Bergson. But it's so interesting to see how these ideas kind of flowed through these people. So that we've got the present as a mathematical point, or the concept, and the present as the real lived present, which is duration, which is sensory motor, which is the consciousness that I have of my body, tying that into the body. We also need to stop thinking of the present as that which is, as opposed to that which was and that which will be. Because when we think about it like that, it's kind of a prejudice that leads us to think of the past as no longer real, and the future, well, the past is not real and the future is not real. that leads us to think that those things are then illusions, or they're mental constructions, or something that have no reality. Whereas we've just seen there is no present without the past and the future. They're intimately bound up with the present. So when we think of the present as that which is, we're kind of blinkering ourselves to the reality, which is that the past and the future are equally real. So he says the present, instead of being what is, the present is what is being made. Constant creativity, which underlies Bergson, which underlies duration, or was an essential feature of it. That sense of becoming, always progressing. No state is ever. Every state is always experienced for the first time. There's always that the element to duration. The present is what is being made, not what is. And finally, that's the last point, duration in the natural world. So this is good. We've talked about duration a lot and connected it quite closely with psychic states, right? With our, we'll just keep the word psychic states. We connected it with that. But, and I think this is important actually, and it gets us away from perhaps drifting into kind of a more subjectivist kind of territory where it can seem like time is just in the human conception of it, if you like. Something is just in our minds. So duration for Bergson is also in the natural world. It's always also a part of nature outside of human subjectivity. So it's not just something that's limited to us. It's not just all in our heads, if you like. So let me give you the quote and then we'll look at it. Matter thus resolves itself into numberless vibrations, all linked together in uninterrupted continuity, all bound up with each other, and travelling in every direction like shivers through an immense body. Okay, cool. Nice quote again. So, matter when we think about matter, sure, no one believes that matter is kind of fixed anymore, that the physical world, we know that physics has already revealed that it's a place of intense activity. There's lots going on, things always changing. And yet, though, when we tend to think about it, though, we still tend to think about it as fairly inert, right? Matter. We isolate things into states, into discrete states, and we overlook this truth that things are really just constant flux. That is, I mean, it's Heraclitus all the way. Everything's constantly changing. Even what we imagine is stable, what we imagine is fixed, that's only our perspective. There's in essence, in actuality, everything is vibrating. Everything is moving, in flux, changing. It's constant creation, constant becoming. So that's the truth. Becoming is the truth, not being. And what kind of becoming? What kind of becoming is it here? It's vibrations. It's one way of describing it. But whatever it is, there's change. So you have succession. We've got succession of different states, and these different states aren't isolated. They're not locked away from each other. They're all interpenetrating. They're all traveling in every direction like shivers through a body. So there's that interpenetration that we've been talking about, that interconnection. Succession and interconnection, that's what you need for duration. That's what duration is. So we have duration in the natural world. But there are a couple of caveats with that, I think. That one is that it's not the same as the kind of duration that we have as the conscious creatures that we are, because I think for a start there's no memory. So I don't think we can attribute memory to matter. So it lacks something that gives us psychic states. There's no psychic states in nature, even though there is still duration. That's probably how I think we can best think about that. However, matter approaches duration. It has a kind of duration, even though it's not the same as ours. So duration is really the underpinning of everything for Bergson. It's even a part of the natural world outside of human subjectivity. Very important to get that in there. And we'll talk about that. I think we talk about it again later on when we get to creative evolution. It becomes a bit more important. But the other thing that I wanted to mention here is that matter approaches duration only when considered as a whole. And this we will come to later. Only whole organisms endure. So, and you can kind of think about that with a human, right? I endure, you endure, but my finger doesn't endure. So when I abstract, when I break up what is an organic whole, what's an organized whole, then I also break up that duration. That part doesn't endure on its own. The duration only applies to the whole of an organized being. Exactly what an organized being is, we'll talk about a bit later. But the important point for us here is that matter, individual pieces of matter that say science studies, they don't endure. There's no duration there. Matter, only when we consider it as a whole, endures. And that means the whole universe, right? So that's one kind of thing to bear in mind. There is duration in the natural world, but only when we consider the whole of nature. Right, let's check a summary. So first we looked at simultaneity. And this is what we count when we think we are measuring duration. It was when we compare two events, notice that they take place together. That's what simultaneity is. And it's basically a way of spatializing time. We talked about the double effect, which is how duration gets turned into space. The illusion that duration is spatial, is something quantifiable. The first step was mapping our psychic states onto events in the world, and the second step was laying out those events in the world so that they all coexist. And that gives us the illusion that our our psychic states are things that we can count, that we can lay out like other things in space. Then we talked about motion, and there were two parts to motion: progress, which is the duration part, and then position, which is the spatial part. And we saw that motion is in itself indivisible. Motion is a whole, something we can only treat as a whole. The trajectory of the motion, however, is something which is infinitely divisible. And that's because we've broken it down. It's now a thing, and like an object in space. And we also looked at Zeno's paradoxes and saw that they fall into this trap of spatializing motion in exactly the same way that we talked about spatializing time. Then we looked at the lived present. and approach this from the point of view of duration. Very interestingly, we saw that the lived present is sensory motor, the way that there's sensation incorporated into the present from the past, and action the future incorporated into the present through our actions, directing, being goal oriented, directed towards the future. And we had to think about the present not as what is, but as what is being made. So there's that nice feel of creation coming in. And finally, duration in the natural world. Matter approaches duration when we consider it as a totality, as the universe as a whole. And that is where I'm going to finish up this video. Thanks for watching. As always, guys, we'll move on. We'll move on from duration in the next video. Until then, thank you, and I'll see you later.